Good morning. We're really glad to have all of you here in person, and for those who are with us online, we want to welcome you here as well. You'll notice if you're here in person, in the pew next to you, you'll find a couple of invitations for Easter Sunday. We hope that you'll take those with you and be prayerful about who you might hand those to during the week. We'd love to fill this place with folks on Easter Sunday. You'll also notice some sermon notes if you want to use those to follow along this morning in Luke chapter 15. For those of you who read Embrace, you might remember a few weeks ago I shared about the time that Kendra and I saw a showing of Hadestown in New York City. And there's this moment about halfway through the play when Hades, who rules the underworld, sings a particularly poignant song. And it is a song about building walls. And it turns out in this play that the primary work of evil, of Hades, is the work of building walls. And so he sings about those whose souls he's collected in the underworld now have the great task of building a wall and of living securely behind that wall. It's a helpful image as we continue following Jesus through the Gospel of Luke on our way to Easter Sunday, because here in Luke chapter 15 we come to a moment where Jesus is being criticized by the leaders of the religious institution, and he's being criticized because he doesn't have the appropriate walls up to keep out people who don't belong to his ministry, to keep out people who don't belong around his person. Those in charge of the religious institution believe there are some people who have no place around a person of God, who have no place around a ministry of God. And they press Jesus to do more, to build walls to keep those people out. Here in Luke chapter 15, if we could just take a look at the kind of people who are at the table with Jesus, we would find people who have made some terrible mistakes in their lives. And yet Jesus welcomes them to his table. We would find people who haven't necessarily made terrible mistakes in their lives, but who the religious institution looks at and believes they too don't belong here. And yet Jesus welcomes them to his table. And so the religious leaders criticize Jesus in verse 1 of chapter 15. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." One of the harshest accusations the religious institution could make about Jesus was that he receives sinners and eats with them. And they wanted Jesus to do more to build up the wall to keep those people out. It turns out that the work of building walls is not only the work of Hades, it is also the work of the religious institution. And the religious institution now wants Jesus to be part of that work. And so in response to the criticism in Luke chapter 15, Jesus tells three stories. All three stories have the same basic point. We don't have time this morning to walk through all three stories, so we're just going to spend our time in this third story, the story that's often called the parable of the prodigal son. Now, it's helpful to remember that this story is about and is spoken to a culture that is a shame-based culture, a culture in which the needs, the rights, the desires of any one individual are superseded by the needs and the rights and the desires of the community as a whole. We'll just walk back through the story, paying attention to the four main characters in the story: the younger son, the older son, the father, and the servants. So the younger son. The younger son brings shame to himself, to his family, to the whole community in a number of different ways. First, he requests his share of the father's inheritance. Now, there would be occasions in that culture where it would be appropriate for a son to make this request of a living father. But it's clear in this case that the younger son just wants his share of the estate so that he can go and have fun with it all. There is a strong expectation in that culture, as well as in some, especially Middle Eastern or Asian cultures today, that the children would take care of the parents as they age. And now this younger son has taken his share of the inheritance, which at least part of was to be used to care for the father as he aged, and now he's using it entirely for himself. And that would be shameful. It would be dishonorable. He brought shame on himself, on his family, and the whole community in this act. Second, this younger son goes to a distant country. It's so distant that it is clearly not a Jewish country. He finds himself being hired to feed pigs in this country. From the eyes of the Jewish reader, this younger son has gone to a country so distant that it is filled with unclean people, making him unclean. And now he's involved in activities that continue to make him unclean. The older son in the story remarks that this younger son has used some of the inheritance to hire prostitutes. And all of that would have been shameful, would have brought disgrace upon the younger son, upon the family, and upon the larger community. Skye Jethani, in a book called With, writes that this younger son represents people whose spirituality is focused primarily on getting life from God. That is, this younger son represents those of us who primarily look at God, the Father, as a dispenser of goods. God is just a means to an end. He's the means to a better marriage. He's the means to a more fulfilling vocation. He's the means to having some peace and less anxiety during the day. But there's very little consideration given to any relationship with that God. We just take what we want from Him and then go and live whatever life we want to live. The older son. The older son also brings shame on himself, on his family, and on the larger community, but he just does it in a very different way. He doesn't take his share of the inheritance and go and waste it. He doesn't leave the father. He stays home and seemingly obediently continues to serve. And yet he also acts in ways that are shameful. So when the younger son comes home and the father generously and graciously welcomes him home, the older son refuses to go into the celebration. This would have been a very public absence. People in the community would have noticed that he was absent from the celebration. And this absence would have been shameful, would have been dishonorable to himself, to his family, and to the larger community. In addition, the older son gets into a public quarrel with his father about the way the father has treated the younger son and the way the father has treated him. People from the community who were present at the celebration would have heard this public squabble. Statements like that from a son to a father in that culture would have been shameful, dishonorable, bringing shame upon himself, his family, and the community. Skye Jethani, in this book With, says that the older son represents people who have a kind of spirituality in which they are living life under God. The older son represents those of us who always feel like we're under the thumb of God. We feel like we're just a hired hand to God, and we're scared what God's going to do next. There's a burden to our spirituality. There's a heaviness to it. There's no joy in it, and there's certainly no relationship in it. And then the father. Surprisingly, the father, like the two sons, also acts in ways that are shameful according to that culture of that day. And so when the younger son comes home, after all the shame he's brought on himself, his family, and the community, the father generously welcomes him home. He has a robe, a ring, and shoes brought for this younger son. He has the fattened calf killed. He has a party thrown to celebrate the return of the younger son. In that culture, as in some cultures even today, if a member of the family had behaved in the way the younger son behaved, he would have been disavowed. He would have been outcast from the family. And so the father, generously welcoming the son in this way, was likely acting in a shameful, disgraceful, dishonorable way. And then many commentators draw attention to the fact that the father ran. When he sees the younger son coming from a distance back home, the father runs to him. And in that culture, for someone of the father's stature and position in the family and the community to run like this would have been disgraceful and dishonorable. And then when the older son argues with the father, refuses to go into the celebration, and accuses the father of treating him like a hired hand, the father's patient with him. The father is kind to him. The father entreats him, begs him to come in and be part of this celebration. The father probably would have been expected to act in a very different way in that situation, and once again is bringing shame and dishonor upon himself. The father acts shamefully, however, for the sake of the two sons, for the sake of the children. In this case, the father acts shamefully and dishonorably so that he might bring those two children back to the table. The father's so committed to building bridges rather than walls that he'll do whatever it takes, even if it takes acting in ways that others look at as shameful and dishonorable. My brother Craig and I were recently at the Harry Potter store in Manhattan. It's filled with an endless supply of goods that you can buy. It's also filled with a lot of different props from all of the different Harry Potter movies. And downstairs in one corner hangs this poster from one of the Harry Potter movies. It declares that Harry Potter is undesirable number one. And in the Harry Potter movies, those who are in power and those who are purists are trying to protect their institutions from people like Harry Potter. They don't want people like Harry Potter polluting the purity of their institutions. And so he is marked as undesirable number one. And it's interesting to think of the way in which symbolically posters like these have existed across every era of history. Depending on what time you're in during history, these posters could have been displayed for people of color, for women, for children, for refugees, for immigrants, for members of the LGBTQ community, for those who had committed whatever was marked at that time and in that place as the most egregious form of sin. And now the leaders of the religious institution want Jesus to make sure that the people who've been coming around him are marked with the same poster. Undesirable, number one. They should be kept out. And Jesus will have none of it. He determines to build bridges rather than walls, even if others, including the religious institution, look at it as shameful and disgraceful. Let's come now to the fourth major character in the story, and it's It's the servants. We don't often even think about the servants. And yet each of the other three characters in the story are interacting with the servants, or at least thinking about the servants. So when the younger son is making his long march home from that distant country, it's the servants that he's thinking about. He's remembering the servants. He's remembering how the father provides such good care for the servants. He's remembering the good life the servants have back home, and he's thinking to himself, if the father won't receive me back as a child, as a member of the family, perhaps he'll receive me back as a servant. His mind is filled with thoughts of the servants. When he finally arrives home and the father interacts with him, it's the servants the father turns to. He needs the servants to bring the robe, the ring, and the shoes. He needs the servants to kill the fattened calf, to throw the celebration. Nothing is going to happen without the servants. And when the older son is out in the field and he hears this ruckus going on because the celebration is now in full force, it's a servant that he turns to and asks what's going on here and tries to get some explanation for this shameful activity on the part of the father. Each one of the three other characters in the story are either thinking about or interacting with the servants. And I want to suggest that it's the servants who embody the primary invitation of this text. Bartolomé Esteban Murillo painted his Return of the Prodigal Son in the 17th century. Like most painters with this central scene in the story, he's used people from his own time, images from his own places to repopulate this image, and that's fine. But he does something that very few artists do with this scene from the Return of the Prodigal Son. He reserves the richest colors for the servant on the right, who's got the ring, the robes, and the shoes. The center of the painting is the father and the younger son, and of course a dog. But to the right, with the richest colors, is the servant, with the robe, the rings, and the shoes. That's where the eye is drawn to. And I think it was Murillo's way of saying, look at the servants. Think about the servants. Consider what it means to be a servant. Because I think it's the servants who represent the primary invitation of this story. Think about the role of the servants. The role of the servants is simply to bring the robe and the ring and the shoes to whomever the father points, no matter how anyone else feels about it. The role of the servants is to kill the fattened calf, to throw a party for whomever the father desires, no matter how anyone else feels about it. The role of the servants is to invite people to come to the party, to be part of the celebration, no matter how anyone else feels about it. One of the things that the parable of the prodigal son does is invite us to adopt the role of the often overlooked servants. The servants aren't given the burden of having to debate who's in, who's not, who's welcome, who's not. They're just given the grace of bringing the robe, the ring, the shoes, and the party to whomever the father points. No matter how senseless or shameful anyone else feels it to be. What a joy to be a servant. You don't have to worry your heart, you don't have to wring your hands anymore over who gets grace, who gets law, who gets a seat at the table and who doesn't. You don't even have to worry anymore about what anyone else thinks. All you have to do is listen to the Father. And whoever he points to, whoever he says, bring the robe, bring the ring, bring the shoes. Whoever he desires, throw the party, and everything else be the burden of the Father. What a joy to be a servant and to no longer carry the weight of the burden of discerning who gets it and who doesn't, who deserves it and who doesn't. I think ultimately in this story, Jesus is inviting us to lay down every other role and to take on the role of the servant. And so let me ask you as we close, if you had the freedom to just be a servant this week, who might you welcome? In the name of the Father,